What's going on, guys? It's Jimmy here. So, we now know the truth about COVID's origin. And this is now coming out here, crazy enough as it is, this many years later. We now know the first three people to get the virus worked in the Wuhan lab. Will the US government act? Will they do anything? Can they do anything? But isn't it interesting that we now know the first three people actually came from the Wuhan lab? Now, I'm sure a lot of people thought this, but now we're actually learning this information. New report points to Wuhan Institute scientists as patient zero of C19, strengthening the lab leak theory. Here's the details on this. The SARS-CoV-2 virus, which caused the C19 pandemic, first infected three scientists working at China's infamous Wuhan Institute of Virology lab, according to a new report that strengthens the theory of the lab leak. Quote, patients zero included the scientists working on the controversial gain of function research on SARS like viruses at the Wuhan Institute of Viruses. Yeah, so let me know your thoughts here in this. Take a look at this video here.
New report says scientists at the Wuhan Institute of Virology conducting gain-of-function research were the first humans to contract COVID in the fall of 2019, just months before the outbreak of the virus that killed nearly 7 million people worldwide. Former CDC Director Dr. Robert Redfield, who was at the helm of the start of the pandemic, joins us now. So this is information that comes to us from Michael Schellenberger and Matt Taibbi. They report that three of the very first people to come down with COVID worked at that Institute of Virology, including Ben Hu, who led the Institute's gain-of-function research and was a top student of the so-called Batwoman, Shi Zhenli. What do you think of these latest claims, Doctor?
You know, John, I think they're very important. As I've said for some time, I think the answer to the origin of COVID is going to come from the intelligence community. And I think hopefully next week there's going to be more intelligence released. There has been, I think, strong evidence that there was infections that occurred in the laboratory both in September and November. And we're hearing more specific from these reporters, which I suspect their information is grounded in truth. We'll have to see what the intelligence community releases next week.
Yeah, again, what you're referring to there is a report that was signed off on by President Biden a number of months ago. All of the intelligence regarding the origins of COVID and the Wuhan Institute of Virology is supposed to be declassified, including listing the names of all of the researchers who got sick. If people were getting sick in September, and as you pointed out later that fall in China, and this is 2019, before we had the first cases here, does that, and they came from the Institute, does that suggest that this idea of it originating naturally from the wet market is probably not the plausible cause for this pandemic?
Yeah, John, I've always felt that the wet market narrative was a roost to try to move attention away from the laboratory. I think if you really look critically and at the evidence that we have for spillover, other than some prominent individuals promoting it as what they believe happened, there is really no evidence to support spillover. But there is really growing evidence now that supports that this epidemic started in a laboratory, presumably the Wuhan Institute of Virology. There's also the CDC Virology Institute in Wuhan. Those are the two major laboratories that have been implicated as potentially being the source of this virus.
Earlier this year, when the Department of Energy came out and said it looks like it was a lab leak that was responsible, when the FBI said the same thing, Dr. Anthony Fauci, who had departed the NIH by that point, was asked about it. And he seemed to be rather dismissive of the whole idea of getting to the bottom of this. Listen to what he said.
Do you think we'll ever know how the pandemic originated?
Might not.
It very well might not. We may not ever know. That's unfortunate, but that's the possibility that we might not ever know.
Now, I'm not asking you here to dump on a former colleague, but he was rather dismissive about the whole thing. And you would think if anybody really wanted to get to the bottom of how this whole thing started, it would be him, unless he doesn't want to know.
Yeah, John, Tony and I have been friends for a long time, but I'm very disappointed in how he's responded to this. Largely, I think it's grounded in his advocacy for gain of function research. I think he's a strong advocate for gain of function research, and I'm a strong advocate for a moratorium on gain of function research. The investigative report that you're just talking about suggests that these three scientists were the initial infections in November, although I think there was evidence for infections back in early September also. But it's of note that they were the key scientists that were leading the gain of function research in that laboratory.
So a paper that was published back in the fall of 2020 highlighted the importance of finding out how COVID originated. It said in part, quote, understanding how COVID-19 emerged is a critical point on a steep learning curve we must quickly master. As we face the mounting deaths and societal upheavals of the COVID-19 pandemic, we must not lose sight of how this pandemic began, how and why we missed the warning signs, and what we can do to prevent it from happening again and again. That was written when the prevailing theory was that it came out of a wet market. But it speaks to the importance of if you're not curious, if you're not diligent, if you don't get to the bottom of this, you're doomed to repeat the mistakes of the past.
Yeah, I think one of the biggest disappointments, and I've said this publicly before, is I was a strong advocate in January of 2020 that NIH should lead a scientific investigation into the two hypotheses, spillover and laboratory leak. And unfortunately, very rapidly, what happened in January 31st, February 1st, there was a movement to coalesce around a single narrative, which was that this was a natural spillover event. That's the only hypothesis that really should be entertained. People like me that thought it may be a lab leak were classified as conspiratorial. And I tried to argue then that that whole approach was antithetical to science, because what science normally does is foster rigorous debate. And we have a high degree of confidence that science will eventually figure out the truth. Now I'm of the view that we're going to get to the answer. And I do agree with that article. Getting to the answer is critical, because in order for to have the energy that we're going to need as a society and a world, I think to put limitations on gain of function research, we need to understand that it is most likely the gain of function research led to this pandemic. And I've said before that I do believe the great pandemic is coming. It's going to be a bird flu pandemic, and I do believe it's likely to come from gain of function research or bioterrorism. And our best defense against that pandemic is going to be to curtail gain of function research.
Yeah, so he thinks that a worser pandemic, the great pandemic, will still be yet to come. This comes as over 1 million Americans have died from the C-19 pandemic. About 7 million people worldwide have died from this pandemic. Um, yeah, so yeah, and that there will be a worser one to come here, a bird flu. Now, remember, we did actually have a really bad bird flu here over the last few years, the avian bird flu, which is what actually caused eggs prices to spike really high. There was actually millions of birds that died from it. So keep that in mind. Just so you've probably heard me talk about this if you've been watching my show. So there has been a significant bird flu that has been going on. It didn't really affect the human population except for the price of eggs. Yeah. So, and the other question here is that what will happen to China for potentially causing this? What can we do? Can we hold them accountable? Let me know your thoughts here in the comments. What could we do or can we do? Will they acknowledge anything? Yeah, so you can let me know there. I don't think they're going to acknowledge anything, but we'll see what happens here. I'll keep you up to date here with everything going on here in our country on a daily basis. Don't forget to click the subscribe button down below and then the bell icon if you haven't yet so you don't miss out on any new videos. I'll continue to try to bring you guys the truth here on everything happening here around the world. Also, thanks for liking and sharing these videos. Here's some videos you should watch next. Here's Russia saying that there will be a U.S. nuclear strike. God forbid. And here is the Fed saying that more bank failures are coming. So click on one of those videos next. Thanks for watching, guys, and I'll see you in the next video.